The crack of thunder split the evening sky as Grace Thornton clutched the reins of her exhausted horses, the wheels of her wagon sinking deeper into the mud with each desperate attempt to move forward. She had been traveling for weeks, her life's possessions packed behind her, and now merely miles from her destination of Tucumcari, New Mexico territory. Her journey had come to an abrupt halt as the rear axle of her wagon groaned and then snapped with a sickening crack. It was 1885, and Grace was 23 years old with nothing but determination and the deed to a small plot of land left to her by her late father. The rain poured mercilessly, soaking through her traveling coat as she climbed down from the wagon seat to inspect the damage. Her gloved hands trembled, partly from cold and partly from the crushing realization that she was stranded. "Come on," she whispered to her horses, patting their wet flanks. "We need to find shelter." Leading her team forward, Grace trudged through the thickening mud, the broken wagon dragging awkwardly behind. Through the curtain of rain, she could make out the silhouette of a ranch house sitting atop a small rise about a quarter-mile ahead. Lights glowed warmly in the windows, a beacon of hope in the gathering darkness. By the time she reached the gate of the property, Grace was shivering uncontrollably. She managed to secure her horses to a post before stumbling up to the front door, her boots heavy with mud. Summoning what little strength remained, she knocked loudly. The door swung open, revealing a tall man with broad shoulders, his features partially obscured by the shadow cast from the lantern behind him. He wore a simple cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing tanned, muscular forearms. "I'm terribly sorry to disturb you, sir," Grace began, her voice quavering with exhaustion. "My wagon broke down on the road. The axle snapped clean through." The man stepped forward, and the light from the lantern illuminated his face strong, weather-beaten, with piercing blue eyes beneath a furrowed brow. A shadow of stubble darkened his jaw, and his dark hair was slightly damp, as if he'd just run his hands through it. "You're soaked to the bone, miss," he said, his voice deep and tinged with concern. He glanced past her toward her wagon and team. "That's a bad break in this weather. I was hoping. Perhaps you might know of someone who could help repair it." Grace asked, trying to maintain her composure despite her chattering teeth. The man studied her for a moment, then stepped aside. "Come in first. You'll catch your death out there." As Grace hesitated, he added, "Vaughn Jackson, this is my ranch." Grace stepped across the threshold, immediately enveloped by the warmth of a crackling fire. "Grace Thornton," she replied, accepting his outstretched hand briefly. "I'm terribly sorry about this intrusion." "No intrusion," Vaughn said, closing the door behind her. "Let me get those horses into the barn first. Then we can figure out what to do about your wagon." Grace started to protest that she should help, but Vaughn had already donned his hat and oilskin coat, disappearing into the downpour. Through the window, she watched as he efficiently unhitched her team and led them toward a large barn. Even in the driving rain, there was something graceful about the way he moved, confident and capable. While he was gone, Grace took in her surroundings. The ranch house was simple but well built, with sturdy furniture that spoke more of function than decoration. A bookshelf stood against one wall, surprisingly full for a ranch home, and a desk in the corner was piled with papers and ledgers. This was clearly a working ranch, but one run with care and attention. Vaughn returned 15 minutes later, water streaming from his coat. "Your horses are settled," he said, hanging his dripping hat on a peg by the door. "And I had a look at your wagon. That axle's broken clean through." Grace's heart sank. "How long will it take to repair?" Vaughn ran a hand through his wet hair. I've got the tools, and I might have a piece of oak that would work for a new axle, but it'll need to be properly shaped and the fittings secured. He studied her tired face. It's not a quick fix, Miss Thornton. 3 days at minimum, and that's if the weather clears. 3 days, Grace repeated, dismayed. Vaughn nodded, then said simply, "Then stay till it's fixed." "I couldn't possibly impose. It's not an imposition," he interrupted. "I've got a spare room." "You can stay here until your wagon's ready to travel again." Grace hesitated, weighing her limited options. She had no money for a hotel in town, assuming she could even reach it in this weather, and camping with a broken wagon was impossible. "I would be happy to earn my keep," she said finally. "I'm quite capable around a house or kitchen." Something that might have been amusement flickered in Vaughn's eyes. "I won't turn down help with the cooking. Been living on my own for a while now." "Then we have an agreement," Grace said, extending her hand formally despite her bedraggled appearance. Vaughn's large hand enveloped hers, warm and calloused. "We do." "My belongings are staying dry under the canvas," he assured her. "We'll bring in what you need when the rain lets up." As if emphasizing his point, another crack of thunder shook the house, and the rain intensified, drumming on the roof overhead. "For now," Vaughn continued, moving to a small cupboard, "you need dry clothes." He pulled out a clean shirt and a pair of trousers that would clearly be much too large for her. "These will have to do until we can get to your trunk." Grace accepted the clothes with a grateful nod. "Thank you, Mr. Jackson." "Vaughn," he corrected. "We don't stand on ceremony much out here." He showed her to a small bedroom off the main living area. "The washroom is through there," he said, indicating a door to the right. "I'll heat some water for you." Left alone, Grace took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing thoughts. Just that morning, she had been filled with anticipation about reaching Tucumcari and starting her new life. Now she found herself stranded at a stranger's ranch, dependent on his kindness. And yet, there was something about Vaughn Jackson that made her feel she could trust him. Perhaps it was the straightforward way he spoke, or the quiet confidence with which he moved. Whatever it was, Grace was grateful to have found shelter in the storm, both the one raging outside and the one that had been building in her heart since her father's death 6 months ago. After changing into Vaughn's clothes, which she had to roll at the sleeves and legs and cinch tightly at the waist, Grace emerged to find him in the kitchen, stirring something in a pot that filled the air with a savory aroma. "Just a simple stew," he said, noticing her. "But it's hot." As they ate at the small kitchen table, Grace found herself studying her host. In the lamplight, she could see that Vaughn was probably in his early 30s. His face was tanned from outdoor work, with fine lines at the corners of his eyes suggesting he smiled more than his current serious demeanor indicated. His hands were strong and capable as they handled his spoon and tore chunks from a loaf of bread. "Have you lived in this area long?" Grace asked, breaking the comfortable silence that had fallen between them. "Born and raised," Vaughn replied. "My father started this ranch when there wasn't much more than open territory out here. Been running it myself since he passed 5 years ago." "I'm sorry for your loss," Grace said quietly. Vaughn acknowledged her sympathy with a slight nod. "And you? What brings you to New Mexico territory all on your own?" Grace stirred her stew thoughtfully. "My father died this past winter. He left me a small plot of land near Tucumcari. I was a schoolteacher back in Missouri, but there was nothing keeping me there after he was gone." "Teaching's good work," Vaughn commented. "Tucumcari could use a proper teacher. The town's growing." "That's what I'm hoping," Grace admitted, "though I'll need to establish myself first. Perhaps grow something on the land to support myself while I seek a teaching position." Vaughn's expression turned skeptical. "Farming around here isn't easy. The land can be harsh." I'm tougher than I look, Mr. Jackson Vaughn, Grace corrected herself with a small smile. My father taught me well. Something in her tone must have convinced him because he nodded slowly. I believe you might be at that, Miss Thornton. Grace, she insisted. As you said, we needn't stand on ceremony. The rain continued through the night and into the next day, making work on the wagon impossible. Grace woke early, accustomed to rising with the sun, and found Vaughn already in the kitchen, preparing to head out to tend to his livestock. There's coffee on the stove, he said, pulling on his boots. And help yourself to whatever you find for breakfast. I'll be back in a few hours. Left alone in the house, Grace set about making herself useful. She explored the kitchen, finding it functional but lacking a woman's touch. She prepared a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush with the last of some dried berries she found in a jar, leaving a portion warming for Vaughn's return. Then she turned her attention to the house itself. It was clean enough, but there were signs of neglect in the corners and a layer of dust on the higher shelves. Grace found cleaning supplies in a small pantry and set to work, grateful for the activity to occupy her mind. By midday, when Vaughn returned, the main living area was spotless. The wooden floors gleamed and fresh coffee was brewing. He paused in the doorway, his expression a mixture of surprise and something that looked almost like embarrassment. You didn't need to do all this, he said, removing his mud-caked boots at the door. I wanted to, Grace replied simply. It helps me feel useful, and I meant what I said about earning my keep. Vaughn's eyes traveled around the room, taking in the transformation. Well, I can't say it doesn't look better, he admitted. Thank you. They ate a simple lunch together, and Vaughn explained his plans for the wagon repair once the weather cleared. I've got a piece of oak I've been saving that should work for the axle. Needs to be properly shaped, though. Have you repaired many wagons? Grace asked. A few. Out here, you learn to fix everything yourself or you don't survive long. He glanced out the window at the still falling rain. Weather reports said this would clear by tomorrow, then we can get to work. Grace raised an eyebrow. A slight smile tugged at Vaughn's mouth. I wouldn't turn away an extra pair of hands if you're offering. I am, she confirmed. Though I should warn you, my wagon repair skills are somewhat limited. You can learn, he said simply. The afternoon passed with Vaughn attending to paperwork at his desk, while Grace mended a stack of shirts she'd found in need of repair. They worked in companionable silence, broken only by the occasional question or comment. It was a strange intimacy, two strangers sharing a space, each absorbed in their own tasks yet aware of the other's presence. As evening approached, the rain finally began to taper off, and Vaughn suggested they retrieve some of Grace's belongings from the wagon. Together they ventured out into the muddy yard, the air fresh and clean after the storm. Grace's wagon sat where Vaughn had moved it, closer to the barn for shelter. The canvas covering had kept most of her possessions dry, and with Vaughn's help, she was able to retrieve a trunk containing her clothes and personal items. Your land is beautiful, Grace commented as they walked back to the house, looking out across the rolling landscape now bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. It has its moments, Vaughn agreed, following her gaze. Harsh in summer, bitter in winter, but spring and fall make up for it. Back at the house, Grace changed into her own clothes, a simple dark blue dress that had seen better days but was clean and neat. When she re-entered the main room, she noticed Vaughn glance up from the book he was reading, his eyes lingering on her for a moment longer than necessary. They prepared dinner together, moving around the small kitchen with surprising ease. Grace made cornbread to accompany the leftover stew, and Vaughn contributed a jar of preserved peaches he'd been saving for a special occasion. Not that this is special, he clarified quickly. Just seemed like a good time to open them. Grace smiled, recognizing the gesture for what it was, a small kindness. They looked delicious. Did you preserve them yourself? Vaughn nodded. My mother taught me, said a man living alone needed to know how to keep food through the winter. She sounds like a wise woman. She was, Vaughn said, a hint of sadness in his voice. Died when I was 16, influenza. I'm sorry, Grace said quietly. My mother passed when I was 12. It's not easy. Their eyes met across the table, a moment of shared understanding passing between them. Then Vaughn cleared his throat and changed the subject, asking about Grace's journey from Missouri. As they talked, Grace found herself relaxing in Vaughn's company. There was something refreshingly direct about him. He didn't engage in the kind of empty social niceties she'd grown accustomed to in town. When he asked a question, he genuinely wanted to know the answer, and when he spoke, his words carried weight. The evening ended with them sitting in front of the fire, Grace with a piece of mending in her lap, Vaughn returning to his book. It was a scene of domestic tranquility that felt strangely natural, considering they had met only the day before. What are you reading? Grace asked eventually, curious about the volume that had captured his attention so thoroughly. Vaughn held up the book so she could see the title. Walden by Henry David Thoreau. I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, Grace quoted with a smile. Vaughn looked genuinely surprised. You've read it. My father had a copy. He believed in living simply, close to the land. She set aside her mending. Do you find that Thoreau speaks to your experience here, in some ways? Vaughn admitted. Though I think he romanticizes solitude somewhat. There's value in it, but also. He trailed off, seeming to search for the right words. Loneliness, Grace suggested gently. Vaughn's eyes met hers, and for a moment his usual reserve seemed to slip. Yes, that. The morning dawned clear and bright, the aftermath of the storm evident only in the muddy yard and the pools of water that reflected the blue sky overhead. Grace rose early again and found Vaughn already outside, assessing her wagon. After a quick breakfast, they set to work. Vaughn moved the wagon into his workshop, a large extension of the barn equipped with tools of all kinds. He explained each step of the repair process to Grace as they worked, showing her how to help sand the new axle he was shaping from the oak timber. You're good with your hands, he commented as she demonstrated a natural aptitude for the careful work. My father believed daughters should learn practical skills just as sons do, Grace replied, running her hand along the smooth wood. Though I admit, wagon repair wasn't part of my education. Vaughn smiled, a genuine, full smile that transformed his face and made him look younger. You're a quick study. They worked through the morning, breaking only for a brief lunch. As they returned to the workshop, Grace noticed Vaughn occasionally glancing her way when he thought she wasn't looking. Each time their eyes accidentally met, he would quickly look away, focusing intently on his work. By late afternoon, the new axle was shaped and ready for fitting. We'll need to let this cure overnight with the oil treatment, Vaughn explained. Then tomorrow we can attach it to the wagon. As they cleaned up the workshop, Grace became aware of how comfortable she felt in Vaughn's presence. There was something steadying about him, a solid, dependable quality that made her feel safe. That evening, Grace insisted on cooking dinner to thank Vaughn for his help. She prepared a chicken she'd found in his cold storage, roasting it with herbs from his small kitchen garden. The result was the best meal either of them had eaten in some time, and Vaughn's appreciation was evident in his request for a second helping. Where did you learn to cook like this? He asked. My aunt taught me after my mother died, Grace explained. She said feeding people properly was an act of love. Vaughn considered this as he ate. Your aunt sounds like a wise woman, too. She was, Grace agreed, though I haven't seen her in years. She moved to California after I was grown. And your father raised you alone after that, Grace nodded. He did his best. He was a good man, just quiet. After my mother died, something in him seemed to close off. She looked down at her plate, suddenly emotional. I sometimes wonder if I'll ever understand what they had together. The kind of love worth grieving over, Vaughn said quietly. That's rare enough. Grace looked up, meeting his gaze. Yes, I suppose it is. The evening passed much like the previous one, except this time they spoke more, sharing stories of their respective childhoods. Vaughn described growing up on the ranch, learning from his father the rhythms of the land and the livestock. Grace told him about her years in school and her decision to become a teacher. What made you want to teach? Vaughn asked. Grace thought about it for a moment. I love the moment when someone understands something new, when you can actually see the knowledge take root. There's nothing quite like it. I can see why you'd be good at it, Vaughn said. You have patience. Do I? Grace laughed. My father might have disagreed. He always said I was too headstrong for my own good. Headstrong isn't always a bad thing, Vaughn observed. Especially not out here. Takes determination to make a life in these parts. Is that why you've stayed? Determination, Vaughn considered the question. Partly. This land is in my blood. I know every creek and hill for miles around, but it's more than that. He gestured vaguely. It's home. I hope to feel that way about my land someday, Grace said softly. You will, Vaughn assured her. It just takes time. The next day was devoted to fitting the new axle to the wagon. It was exacting work that required both precision and strength. Vaughn handled the heavier tasks, but Grace proved herself invaluable with the detailed aspects of the repair. As they worked side by side, Grace became increasingly aware of Vaughn's physical presence. The way his muscles flexed as he lifted the wagon, the careful precision of his hands as he adjusted the fittings, the concentration evident in his expression. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of years of physical labor, every action purposeful and effective. For his part, Vaughn seemed equally aware of Grace. He found reasons to stand close to her, explaining some aspect of the repair that could easily have been demonstrated from a distance. When their hands accidentally touched over a tool, he didn't immediately pull away, and once, when Grace had a streak of grease on her cheek, he reached out instinctively to wipe it away, his fingers lingering against her skin for a heartbeat longer than necessary. By late afternoon, the repair was complete. The new axle was firmly in place, and Vaughn had reinforced the wagon bed for good measure. It's better than it was before, Grace marveled, inspecting the work. Should get you to Tucumcari without any trouble, Vaughn agreed, wiping his hands on a rag. We'll test it tomorrow, make sure everything's solid. The sense of accomplishment they shared was palpable, and their evening meal had an almost celebratory feel. Grace had discovered a supply of dried apples and had made a simple pie, which Vaughn declared the best he'd ever tasted. As they sat by the fire afterward, a comfortable silence between them, Grace realized with a start that she would be leaving the next day. The thought brought an unexpected pang of sadness. What will you do once you reach your land? Vaughn asked, seeming to sense her thoughts. I'm not entirely sure, Grace admitted. There's a small cabin on the property, according to my father's papers. I'll need to make it habitable, then look into teaching opportunities in town. Tucumcari is growing, but it's still rough in places, Vaughn said, a note of concern in his voice. Not always the easiest place for a woman alone. I'm not afraid of hard work or challenges, Grace replied, though she appreciated his concern. No, I don't imagine you are. Vaughn studied her for a moment, but everyone needs help sometimes. If you find you need anything." He trailed off, seemingly unsure how to finish the offer. "Thank you," Grace said simply, understanding what he was trying to say. "I appreciate that more than I can express." The morning they were to test the wagon dawned bright and clear. Grace awoke with mixed emotions: gratitude that her journey could continue, but reluctance to leave the unexpected sanctuary she had found at Vaughn's ranch. After breakfast, they hitched her team to the repaired wagon and took it for a test drive around the property. The new axle performed perfectly, and even the ride seemed smoother thanks to Vaughn's additional reinforcement of the bed. "It's perfect," Grace said as they returned to the house. "I don't know how to thank you." "No need," Vaughn replied, though he seemed pleased by her appreciation. "Just part of being a neighbor." "Even though I'm not quite your neighbor yet," Grace pointed out with a smile. "Near enough," he said. "Tucumcari's not far. Just follow the main road east for about 3 hours and you'll see the town ahead." They spent the rest of the morning packing Grace's belongings back into the wagon. Vaughn insisted on providing her with additional supplies: a sack of flour, some preserved meat, and vegetables from his garden. "Just until you get settled," he said when she tried to protest. "Consider it a housewarming gift." By noon, everything was ready. The wagon was loaded, the team was hitched and rested, and there was nothing left to delay Grace's departure. She stood by the wagon, suddenly finding it difficult to say goodbye. "I can never repay you for your kindness," she began. "You already have," Vaughn interrupted. "The house hasn't been this clean in years, and I haven't eaten this well since my mother was alive." Grace laughed, grateful for his attempt to lighten the moment. "Still, I hope you'll allow me to thank you properly someday. Perhaps you could visit once I'm settled." Something flickered in Vaughn's eyes: hope, perhaps, or anticipation. "I'd like that." There was a pause, neither quite ready to end their time together. Then, suddenly decisive, Vaughn reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden carving: a tiny horse, beautifully detailed. "I made this years ago," he said, holding it out to her. "Thought you might like to have it. A reminder." Grace accepted the carving, touched by the gesture. "It's beautiful, thank you." Their fingers brushed as she took it, and for a moment neither moved. Then Vaughn stepped back, clearing his throat. "You should get going if you want to reach town before dark." Grace nodded, tucking the carving safely in her pocket. She climbed up to the wagon seat, gathering the reins. Vaughn stood beside the wagon, one hand resting on the side as if reluctant to break that final connection. "Goodbye, Vaughn Jackson," Grace said softly. "Thank you for everything." "Safe travels, Grace Thornton," he replied, finally stepping back. "Remember what I said: if you need anything at all, you know where to find me." With a nod and a small smile that couldn't quite hide her sadness, Grace set the team in motion. As the wagon pulled away, she glanced back to see Vaughn still standing where she'd left him, watching her go. She lifted her hand in a final farewell, and he returned the gesture, a solitary figure growing smaller as the distance between them increased. The journey to Tucumcari took just over 3 hours, as Vaughn had predicted. The wagon performed perfectly, the new axle holding firm over even the roughest parts of the road. As Grace crested a small hill, the town came into view below a collection of buildings clustered around a main street, with scattered homesteads dotting the surrounding landscape. Using the directions noted in her father's papers, Grace found her land on the outskirts of town: 15 acres with a small, weathered cabin situated near a stand of cottonwood trees. A creek ran along one edge of the property, providing a reliable water source. The cabin itself was basic but sound. The roof needed some repair, and the single window was missing its glass pane, but the walls were solid, and the stone fireplace appeared to be in working order. It was smaller than she had anticipated, just one main room with a sleeping alcove, but it was hers. Grace unhitched her team and settled them in the small lean-to that served as a stable. Then she unloaded only what she needed for the night, too exhausted to do more. As darkness fell, she sat on the cabin's small porch, eating a simple meal of bread and cheese, looking out over her new property. It should have been a triumphant moment. She had reached her destination. The land was better than she dared hope, and her future stretched before her with possibilities. Yet she felt strangely hollow, as if something essential was missing. As she prepared for bed, Grace took the small wooden horse from her pocket, running her fingers over its smooth surface. In the 3 days she had stayed at Vaughn's ranch, something unexpected had taken root between them, a connection she hadn't been looking for but now couldn't ignore. "Don't be foolish," she told herself firmly. "You barely know the man." Yet as she drifted off to sleep on her first night in her new home, it was Vaughn's face she saw in her mind's eye, his rare smile, the intensity of his gaze, the careful strength of his hands as they worked together on the wagon. The next few days were consumed with making the cabin habitable. Grace repaired the roof with materials purchased in town, replaced the missing window glass, and thoroughly cleaned every surface. She met a few neighbors, including a kind elderly couple named the Millers who lived on the adjacent property, and immediately took her under their wing. "A young woman shouldn't be out here all alone," Mrs. Miller fretted, though she seemed impressed by Grace's determination. "I'm managing well enough," Grace assured her, "and I hope to secure a teaching position in town soon." "Well, as it happens," Mr. Miller said, "the town council's been looking for a teacher. The last one left for Denver 2 months ago." This news sent Grace into town the following day, dressed in her best dress, a dark green wool that brought out the amber flecks in her hazel eyes. She met with the mayor, a bustling man named Harold Wilson, who seemed delighted to discover she had teaching credentials. "We've got 15 children of school age in Tucumcari and the surrounding area," he explained. "The schoolhouse is small but adequate. When could you start?" "As soon as needed," Grace replied, trying to contain her excitement. "Monday next, then," Mayor Wilson declared. "Salary's $40 a month during the school term. Not princely, but it's what we can afford." It was less than she had earned in Missouri, but combined with what she could grow on her land, it would be enough. Grace accepted the position with genuine gratitude, feeling for the first time that her decision to come west had been the right one. As she left the mayor's office, Grace found herself wondering what Vaughn would think of her news. Before she could reconsider, she stepped into the general store and asked for paper and envelope. She composed a brief letter, informing Vaughn of her safe arrival, the condition of her property, and her new position as Tucumcari's schoolteacher. "I hope this finds you well," she wrote in closing. "Your kindness continues to mean a great deal to me." She signed it simply, Grace, and left it with the postmaster for delivery. The days passed quickly as Grace settled into her new life. She prepared the schoolhouse for her students, planted a vegetable garden beside her cabin, and gradually transformed the small building into a home. Mrs. Miller proved an invaluable friend, showing Grace how to navigate life in the territory and introducing her to other families in the area. Yet, despite her busy days and growing circle of acquaintances, Grace often found herself thinking of Vaughn in quiet moments. She would take out the wooden horse he had given her, wondering if her letter had reached him, if he ever thought of her. A week after sending her letter, Grace returned from the schoolhouse to find a package waiting on her porch. Inside was a set of hand-carved wooden alphabet blocks and a note in a strong, angular hand. "For your classroom. Every teacher needs proper tools. VJ. Grace ran her fingers over the smooth blocks, each letter carefully formed and sanded to a perfect finish. It must have taken hours to make them. The gesture touched her deeply, not just for its thoughtfulness, but for what it represented: Vaughn's support of her new role, his desire to remain connected to her life in some way. She wrote him a thank you note that evening, describing her first days of teaching and how much her students had enjoyed the blocks. This time, she ended the letter with a more personal touch. "The cabin feels more like home each day, though I find myself missing our conversations by the fire." Thus began a correspondence that bridged the physical distance between them. Every week or so, they exchanged letters, Vaughn's brief but meaningful, Grace's longer and more detailed. Through their written words, they continued to learn about each other in ways that perhaps wouldn't have been possible face to face, given Vaughn's natural reserve. He wrote about the daily rhythms of ranch life, the challenges of the approaching winter, books he was reading. Grace shared stories of her students, her gardening successes and failures, her growing friendship with the Millers. Between the lines of their letters ran a current of deepening connection, a gradual revealing of their inner selves. As autumn progressed, Grace found herself watching the road whenever she was working outside, hoping to see a familiar figure on horseback. Yet Vaughn never came, though his letters continued regularly. She wondered sometimes if she had imagined the connection between them, if perhaps for him it had been simply neighborly kindness after all. Then, in early November, a powerful storm hit the territory. For 3 days, rain fell in torrents, turning the creek that bordered Grace's property from a gentle stream into a raging torrent that threatened to overflow its banks. On the third night, as Grace lay awake listening to the howling wind and pounding rain, a loud crack from outside sent her rushing to the window. One of the large cottonwood trees had split, crashing down onto the corner of her cabin. The roof partially collapsed, allowing rain to pour in, and a large branch had shattered the newly replaced window. Grace grabbed what she could: a coat, her father's pocket watch, Vaughn's wooden horse, and fled the cabin, fighting her way through the storm to the Miller's home. The elderly couple took her in immediately, setting up a bed for her in their spare room. "You'll stay with us until your cabin can be repaired," Mrs. Miller insisted, brooking no argument. The next morning, the storm finally broke. Grace returned to her cabin to assess the damage. It was worse than she had feared. The roof would need significant repair, the window replaced again, and the wall where the tree had struck was partially caved in. It was more than she could manage alone, and hiring help would cost more than her modest savings could cover. Mr. Miller offered to speak with some men in town about organizing a work party to help with repairs, but with winter approaching, everyone was busy preparing their own properties. It might be weeks before sufficient help could be arranged. That evening, sitting at the Miller's kitchen table, Grace made a decision. She wrote a letter to Vaughn, explaining what had happened and asking if he might recommend someone who could help with the repairs at a reasonable price. It was difficult for her to ask for help, but she had no other option if she wanted to be back in her own home before winter truly set in. 3 days later, as Grace was returning from the schoolhouse, she saw a horse and wagon approaching the Miller's farm. As the rider came into focus, her heart leaped. It was Vaughn, his familiar broad-shouldered silhouette unmistakable even at a distance. He pulled up in front of the house just as she reached the gate, dismounting with fluid grace. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, months of written words hanging in the air between them. "Your letter came," Vaughn said finally, his voice exactly as she remembered it. "Thought it would be faster to come myself than to write back with recommendations." Grace found herself suddenly fighting tears. "You didn't have to do that, I know." His eyes held her steadily. "I wanted to." Mrs. Miller appeared on the porch then, quickly assessing the situation with a knowing smile. "You must be Mr. Jackson," she said, coming down to greet him. "Grace has mentioned you often. Please come in out of the cold." Over hot coffee, Grace explained the extent of the damage to her cabin. Vaughn listened intently, asking occasional questions about specific aspects of the structure. "I brought tools and materials," he said when she had finished. "Enough to get started, at least. I can see what else we'll need after I've had a look." Grace echoed. "I'm here to help with the repairs," Vaughn said simply. "If that's what you want." Their eyes met across the table, and Grace felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the coffee. "Yes," she said softly. "That's what I want." The Millers insisted Vaughn stay with them as well, setting up a cot for him in their small front room. The next morning, he and Grace rode out to her property to assess the damage in detail. Standing amid the wreckage of her cabin, Grace felt a momentary despair. The storm had undone months of hard work in a single night, but Vaughn's steady presence beside her was reassuring. "It's fixable," he said after a thorough inspection. "The basic structure is still sound. We'll need to clear away the fallen tree first, then repair the roof and wall." "How long do you think it will take?" Grace asked. Vaughn considered. "A week, maybe 2, depending on the weather. Sooner if we can get some help from town." Working together every day, they fell into a natural rhythm. Vaughn handled the heavier tasks, cutting up the fallen tree, rebuilding the damaged wall, replacing roof beams, while Grace focused on the details. Mixing mortar, replacing the window glass, sealing gaps against the approaching winter cold. In the evenings, they returned to the Miller's home, tired but satisfied with their progress. Mrs. Miller always had a hot meal waiting, and after dinner they would sit by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes simply enjoying each other's company in comfortable silence. It was during these quiet evenings that Grace realized how much she had missed Vaughn's physical presence. His letters had maintained their connection, but they couldn't capture the way his eyes crinkled slightly when he was amused, or the precise timbre of his voice, or the reassuring solidity of him sitting across from her. For his part, Vaughn seemed more at ease than he had been during Grace's stay at his ranch. He smiled more readily, spoke more freely, even occasionally joined in when Mr. Miller told one of his long, rambling stories about the early days of the territory. A week into the repairs, they received unexpected help. Word had spread through Tucumcari about Grace's situation, and several of her students' fathers arrived one morning, tools in hand, ready to assist. With the additional help, the work progressed rapidly. "You've made quite an impression on this town," Vaughn commented as they watched the men raise a new roof beam into place. "They're good people," Grace replied. "I've been fortunate to find such a welcoming community." "They're fortunate to have you," Vaughn said, his voice low. "A teacher who cares so much about her students." Grace glanced at him, touched by the sincerity in his voice. "Thank you for coming, Vaughn. I don't know what I would have done without your help." His eyes met hers, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement of the deepening connection they both felt. Then one of the men called for Vaughn's assistance, and the moment passed. By the end of the second week, the cabin was fully repaired, better than before, in fact. Vaughn had reinforced the walls, improved the roof's design to better withstand future storms, and added shelves and cupboards inside that made the small space more functional. On the final evening after the last of the town helpers had departed, Grace and Vaughn stood on the porch of her rebuilt home, looking out over her property as the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. "It's beautiful here," Vaughn said quietly. I can see why your father chose this land. It feels like home now, Grace replied. More than ever. Vaughn turned to face her, his expression uncharacteristically uncertain. I should be heading back to my ranch tomorrow. Winter's coming on and there's much to prepare. Grace felt a pang of disappointment, though she had known this day would come. Of course. You've already stayed longer than you intended, I'm sure. Grace. Vaughn began, then seemed to struggle for words. These past 2 weeks, working beside you, spending evenings together, it's been. Yes, she said simply, understanding what he couldn't quite express. For me too. Vaughn took a step closer to her. I don't want to go back to just letters, he said finally, his voice low and intense. I want more than that. Grace's heart quickened. What are you saying, Vaughn? He reached out, gently taking her hand in his. I'm saying that when your wagon broke outside my ranch, I never expected. He paused, gathering himself. I never expected to find someone who would become so important to me, someone I would think about every day. Someone whose letters I would read again and again. Grace's breath caught. I've thought of you too, she admitted. More than I should, perhaps. Vaughn's hand tightened around hers. I'm not good with words, Grace, but I know what I feel, and what I feel for you it's more than friendship. More than I've ever felt for anyone. In the fading light, Grace could see the vulnerability in his eyes, this strong, capable man laying his heart bare before her. Without hesitation, she stepped forward, closing the distance between them. I feel the same, she whispered. For a moment, they stood there, the admission hanging in the air between them. Then Vaughn leaned down slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. But Grace rose to meet him, and when their lips touched, it felt like the most natural thing in the world, as if all the letters, all the shared work, all the quiet conversations had been leading to this moment. The kiss was gentle at first, a question being answered. Then, as Grace's arms wound around Vaughn's neck, it deepened into something more passionate, more urgent, all the feelings they had carefully contained now finally given expression. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Vaughn rested his forehead against hers. I don't want to leave you, he murmured. Then don't, Grace replied simply. Not yet. That night, they sat before the fire in Grace's newly repaired cabin, talking about possibilities, how they might bridge the distance between his ranch and her home in Tucumcari, how they could build a future together. It's not an easy thing I'm proposing, Vaughn said. My ranch is my livelihood, and you've made a place for yourself here with the school. Life is rarely simple, Grace responded, but some things are worth the complications. They decided that Vaughn would return to his ranch. For now, there was too much that needed his attention before winter set in. But he would come to Tucumcari when he could, and perhaps Grace could visit the ranch during school holidays. And in the spring, Vaughn said, taking her hand, if you still feel as you do now, perhaps we could discuss a more permanent arrangement. Grace understood what he was saying, not rushing her, giving them both time to be certain of their feelings. It was characteristic of him, this careful consideration, and she loved him for it. I will still feel this way in the spring, she assured him, squeezing his hand, and in summer and in all the seasons to come. Vaughn left the next morning, but not before promising to return for Christmas, just a few weeks away. Their parting was bittersweet, difficult after their time together, but eased by the certainty of reunion. The weeks passed slowly for Grace. She threw herself into her teaching, preparing a special Christmas program with her students. She wrote to Vaughn often, and his replies came regularly, each letter a treasured connection until they could be together again. 2 days before Christmas, as Grace was decorating her cabin with pine boughs and red ribbons, there was a knock at her door. She opened it to find Vaughn standing there, snow dusting his shoulders, his face ruddy from the cold. Before she could speak, he swept her into his arms, kissing her with an intensity that took her breath away. "I couldn't wait any longer," he said when they finally parted. "I missed you too much." Over the Christmas holidays, Vaughn stayed with Grace in her cabin. They attended the town's festivities together, and Grace introduced him properly to her students and their families. Seeing him interact with the children, patient, kind, genuinely interested in their stories, only deepened her feelings for him. On Christmas Eve, as they sat before the fire after returning from the town's celebration, Vaughn presented Grace with a small, carefully wrapped package. "It's not much," he said as she unwrapped it, "but I thought you might like it." Inside was a delicate silver pendant in the shape of a book, hanging from a fine chain. When Grace opened the tiny book, she found it was actually a locket, containing a small picture of her cabin on one side and Vaughn's ranch house on the other. "It's beautiful," she breathed, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "How did you manage the pictures?" "There's a photographer in Santa Fe who can make them this small," Vaughn explained. "I sent him sketches." Grace immediately put on the necklace, then gave Vaughn his gift, a finely crafted leather journal she had ordered from a catalog, embossed with his initials. "For all your thoughts and observations," she said. "Since you claim not to be good with words, though your letters suggest otherwise." As the fire burned low, they spoke of the future no longer in vague terms, but with specific plans. Vaughn had been thinking about expanding his ranch operations to include property closer to Tucumcari. "There's land for sale adjoining yours," he told her. "Good grazing land. I could run cattle there, build a second house, be closer to you while still maintaining the main ranch." "You would do that?" Grace asked, surprised by the extent of his planning. "I would do a great deal more than that to be with you, Grace Thornton," Vaughn said quietly. "If you'll have me." Grace's heart swelled with emotion. "Are you asking what I think you're asking, Vaughn Jackson?" In answer, Vaughn reached into his pocket and withdrew a small ring, a simple gold band with a single pearl set in the center. "It was my mother's," he said, his voice slightly rough with emotion. "She always said it should go to the woman I loved as much as my father loved her." He took Grace's hand. "I never thought I'd find that woman, until my wagon broke outside my ranch." Tears filled Grace's eyes as she corrected him gently. "My wagon." Vaughn smiled, the firelight reflecting in his eyes. "Your wagon, best broken axle that ever was." He grew serious again. "Grace Thornton, will you marry me?" "Yes," she said without hesitation, her voice clear and certain. "Yes, I will marry you, Vaughn Jackson." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into his arms, Grace knew that the broken wagon that had seemed like such a disaster had actually been the beginning of the greatest journey of her life, one that would continue, with Vaughn beside her, for all the days to come. They were married in the spring of 1886, in a simple ceremony in Tucumcari's small church. The entire town turned out for the celebration, along with ranchers from the surrounding area who had come to know and respect Vaughn during his frequent visits over the winter months. True to his word, Vaughn had purchased the land adjoining Grace's property and had begun building a larger house there, one with room for children. Grace had noted with a blush when he showed her the plans. She continued teaching, at least for the time being, while Vaughn divided his time between the new property and his original ranch, gradually shifting more of his operation closer to Tucumcari. On their wedding night, as they stood on the porch of Grace's cabin, their temporary home until the new house was completed, Vaughn wrapped his arms around his new wife from behind, both of them gazing up at the star-filled sky. "Happy?" he asked, his breath warm against her ear. Grace leaned back against his solid strength, her hands covering his where they rested on her waist. "More than I ever imagined possible," she replied honestly. "When I told you to stay until your wagon was fixed," Vaughn said, a smile in his voice, "I never dreamed you'd stay forever." Grace turned in his arms, reaching up to touch his face. "It was the best advice anyone ever gave me," she said softly, "and I intend to follow it for the rest of our lives." As their lips met in a kiss that held all the promise of their future together, Grace silently thanked the broken axle that had brought her to Vaughn's door, the fortunate accident that had led her not just to shelter from a storm, but to the love of her life. In the years that followed, Grace and Vaughn built a life together that blended the best of both their worlds. Their new home, completed that first summer of their marriage, stood proudly on the land where their properties joined, a symbol of their union, with views of both the town where Grace taught and the open range where Vaughn's cattle grazed. Their first child, a daughter they named Elizabeth after Grace's mother, arrived a year after their wedding, followed 2 years later by a son, James, named for Vaughn's father. As their family grew, so did their ranch operations. Vaughn's careful management and Grace's practical sensibilities proved a powerful combination, and their ranch became one of the most successful in the territory. Grace eventually gave up formal teaching as their family and ranch responsibilities expanded, but she never lost her love of education. She taught their children at home until they were old enough to attend school in Tucumcari, and she often hosted neighboring children for lessons as well. The alphabet blocks Vaughn had carved for her classroom found a new home in their family parlor, where generations of children would learn their letters from them. Through drought and prosperity, through the territory's transition to statehood, through all the changes that the passing years brought, one thing remained constant: the love that had begun when a broken wagon brought them together. Each year, on the anniversary of that rainy night when Grace had arrived at Vaughn's door, they would sit by the fire and tell their children the story of how a disaster had turned into the greatest blessing of their lives. And hanging on the wall of their home, carefully preserved in a shadow box frame, was the broken piece of the original wagon axle, a reminder that sometimes life's unexpected breakdowns can lead to the most beautiful journeys of all.